Hello and welcome to FireDEV, a fireside chat with people in the industry. And today we have Zoe Franznick with us. Welcome, Zoe.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the podcast. So you work at Obsidian. What do you do over there?
I am a narrative designer, so I am the person who uh, helps write the actual dialogue of the game. I write the inventories. When you pick up a gun and you get a little piece of flavor text about it, I write that stuff. I also like to say that I am an advocate of the narrative to the rest of the team because you can be a game writer and you can be a good storyteller, but being a narrative designer is a little bit bigger than that. You have to essentially reach out to the rest of the team and make sure they're all on board, they know what's going on, and sort of represent the story through all of those departments and let the rest of the team do their best work with that in mind.
Okay. And at what stage of the game's development process does a narrative designer come in, typically?
Oh gosh, the narrative designer comes in basically at every stage in the process. At Obsidian, we're very narrative focused, so it really depends on what kind of game you're creating. Because some games don't necessarily have that much narrative in the forefront. I don't think really any game lacks a narrative. Maybe Tetris, for example, but in a lot of modern video game design, narrative is very, very important. And so you'd want someone like a narrative designer or a narrative lead to come in and sit down with the director, with the area designers, with audio engineers, with gameplay programmers at the very start of that ideation process. When you're creating, for instance, a game design document, to sit down and say, okay, how are we going to tell this story? What is the story that we want to tell? And essentially, from the very beginning, a narrative designer will help shape that story and then figure out how that story will be told from the very big macro sections of the game. What is the overall narrative that we're telling, to the very, very micro things like what does the UX look like? Or I work with the UX designers to, okay, when it says X to pick up, what is the actual phrasing that we use there? Is it pick up? Is it play? Is it X to interact? What does that actually look like? So designers work with the team, with the director from the very, very beginning of the game to its end. And that can look like a lot of different things throughout the process.
Okay. And because you just mentioned that you work with them and you work on even stuff like, what the wording should be for, picking up object or interacting with something in the game world. Would you play other games, especially in a similar genre to the game that you're developing, to see the sort of language they're using to try and maybe, because obviously players will probably expect something similar, like something like Need for Speed, a racing game, will have different terminology to something like Fallout would.
Yes, exactly. And funnily enough, one of the biggest parts of my job is actually intaking a lot of games, a lot of media, a lot of stories. And so that can be basically games in any genre. That can be TV, that can be literature. My background is actually in medieval literature, so I use a lot of that inspiration in how I create games and write stories. What kind of themes can I incorporate there? But yeah, we'll be inspired by and use basically any kind of interesting media that we find. And there's a lot of ways to be very innovative. So, for instance, like you were saying, maybe we want to lean into things that are already familiar. So, for instance, what games has Obsidian made previously? Okay, if we're working on a new iteration of, for instance, Fallout or a new iteration of Outer Worlds, we want to rely on that IP and what we've established and carry that forward. But at the same time, we also want to look outside of the box and say, okay, what have other games or other media done that's very, very innovative? And what can we pull from that and incorporate in a way that we haven't seen in video games do before?
Okay, you mentioned medieval literature. You run your own podcast called Medieval and Geeky Podcast. Tell us about that. and how that came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So our podcast is the Maniculum podcast, and essentially it is where I, myself, and my co-host Mac is a PhD candidate at Purdue University. He and I sit down and essentially go through weird medieval texts, and we teach listeners like you guys how to take those ideas in medieval texts and turn them into TTRPG ideas. So maybe that's a new D&D subclass. Maybe that's a new encounter that you can use. Maybe it's something for your writing. It doesn't actually have to be for TTRPGs. It can just be any kind of inspiration. But the point of that podcast was particularly to give broader access to this weird, wonderful world of medieval literature. So the way that Mac and I came up with that was essentially we'd been bandying about this idea of how can we increase access to medieval literature and make it more engaging for a modern audience, because one of the things that really bothers me is the paywall in academia, where you don't necessarily have people who can access these really interesting texts because either they're not written in a language that people can read or understand. They're written in Latin, for instance, and there's not a translation, or they're behind a publisher's paywall, or, you know, you have to be in academia or you don't understand the context behind it, and it's very difficult to interpret. And that's why a lot of people really struggle to get into history and get into medieval literature. And Mac and I both love this field and said, we want to make it more accessible. And so we came up with this idea, namely because I love game development. I love incorporating that. I love writing. So we said, okay, a lot of this stuff that we see in modern RPGs is based on the things that we see in medieval text: tournaments, quests, notice boards, where you pick up a quest and you go on that journey, on that adventure. All of that stuff comes from medieval literature. So why don't we go back to that and share how to make it fresh, make it new, less tropey, less cliche, and also sort of give people access into this world that they probably haven't even considered is interesting or fun. So that's honestly how that came about. When COVID hit, we had a whole bunch of time and started it up then, and it just hasn't stopped.
Okay, so it was because of COVID, you ended up stopping it.
Isn't everything?
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. So I'm guessing you can read Latin then?
Yes, I've actually been doing Latin for about 15 years. I started when I was around 10.
Okay, well, what made you, learn Latin? Was it like a course at school, like a language? What was the intro, or was it something else?
I had a very strange upbringing, a very classical education. So much like if your listeners have played Pentiment, our main character, Andreas, talks about the trivium and the quadrivium. And that's essentially how I was also raised, in this very weird medieval university style, where you start with reading, writing, arithmetic, and Latin is at its core a part of that. And that is how the university used to function. Even in like Tolkien's day and age, for instance, in the early 1900s, things like that. That's how the university functioned, was from those medieval roots. And so I was brought up in that tradition, and Latin was just part of the curriculum. And so a lot of us didn't enjoy doing Latin. I was one of the strange individuals who really liked it. We also took ancient Greek. I hated ancient Greek comparatively. But it was just part of the curriculum in this old tradition. And I have felt very vindicated that I get to use Latin, for instance, in Pentiment and in game dev, but also in my studies, in my master's in medieval literature. So I don't know, it's brought me a lot of use, but I understand that, it is a dead language and not many people use it, but I've found it to be extremely rewarding.
I mean, you made it work, so...
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, what resources would you recommend for somebody that would be interested in learning Latin?
Oh gosh, for learning Latin, there's a lot of resources online. The curriculum that I used was Henley, which is Henle, which is a very old textbook, but you can follow along with yourself. They've got a grammar book, they've got Latin level 1, they've got Latin level 2. For those of you who are younger or have kids who might be interested in this stuff, I actually taught Latin with Memoria Press, which is sort of the school that I grew up with. And they developed their own Latin curriculum that's very easy to follow along. I will say there are a few places, I think Yale, maybe Columbia, a couple different universities now have speaking Latin clubs and groups where it's very much more of a, rather than a sit down, write and translate it, it's more of a lingual speaking thing. So that's really, really cool. But if you're interested in that, I would say check out Memoria Press. They've got some cool things for younger learners. Also, the Henley books are fantastic. And YouTube. I mean, YouTube has fantastic resources. The internet is a wonderful place, and geeks like myself will go out of their way to share our love of Latin. So YouTube is also a great place to look for that stuff.
Okay, so circling back to Obsidian, you're working on Pentiment. Have you worked on any other titles at Obsidian?
Not before Pentiment. Pentiment was my first game. I am now currently working on Avowed. That's in development, so I can't speak much about that, but Pentiment was my first game. Yeah.
Okay. And okay, I understand you can't speak too much about the new game that you're working on. Is it an announced title, unannounced? Is it like Pentiment, or is it like more 3D based, a bit bigger like Fallout?
It has been announced, so it's called Avowed. We've announced it. But that's pretty much all I can say at the moment. We're pretty close-lipped about it.
Yeah.
But I'm very excited about it. And we're doing a lot of hard work on it, and I'm just super excited.
Okay, that sounds good. So, how does one go about becoming a narrative designer? It sounds fun, sounds very interesting, and also very important to, I mean, a lot of games, like you were saying, except for probably like Tetris or Space Invaders, probably. But for a lot of games, but especially games like Fallout, those sort of titles and Elder Scrolls definitely benefit from it. But it's not a role that seems to have an obvious degree like games programming or games design or game artist. When I was at uni and I did games programming, I remember those sort of degrees. I don't remember a narrative designer. What's like the go-to degree to go into that path, if any?
That's a great question. And it's something that is very unclear, especially to those who are interested in the field. And so I sort of made my own way. There aren't a lot of, as far as I know, there's not any degree in narrative design itself. It's usually tied up with game design and things like that. And because of that, I feel like it's a very underserved part of the curriculum in a lot of games degrees. And to that end, I think that if you want to be a narrative designer, you absolutely can get a games degree, but it's not necessarily the best way to get into being a narrative designer. You definitely want to understand and have a background in, for instance, branching dialogue, how variables work, all the sorts of programmy-ish things that go along with game development. But for me, for instance, I know very little about programming, computer science, things like that. I've picked up a lot through being in the field, but that is not where I started. That is not my basis of knowledge and understanding. My basis of knowledge and understanding was through my basic English degree and also in that medieval studies degree. So to pave one's way into a narrative design position or role is very non-traditional. And I think my background does a good job of explaining how and why. And that's because I knew that I wanted to be a writer. I just didn't know what that would look like. And so when I was working on my medieval studies master's degree, I said to myself, okay, like I'm going to turn and I'm going to go into game dev. And all my professors thought I was absolutely insane because, like, you know, it's game development. How are you going to turn a medieval studies degree into game development? That's insane. But the entire basis of this degree for me was looking at and understanding the stories, the backgrounds of what are the most impactful stories that humans have ever told, and specifically for me, like English literature, Nordic literature has ever told, because you have to pick a specification for your master's. It can't be all of world literature, unfortunately. So I focus specifically on magic and that transformation quality that comes through in that literature. So, for instance, Beowulf or the Viking sagas or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and why those stories were so important and why they are still used to this day. So that's what I really focused on. And with that, a lot of people said, you know, you're crazy. It's a medieval studies degree. You're trying to get into game dev. How is that even going to work? But for me, what everyone else thought of as a weakness, I thought of as a strength, because all of this background gave me the ability to think about stories in a way that most people, for instance, with a games degree or with an MFA, or that's a Master's of Fine Arts if you're not familiar, and that teaches you how to write. Go get an MFA. I would love to get an MFA. But for me, I can learn those skills in other ways, or I have those skills in other ways. But it's really digging into that history and that story through medieval literature and even, you know, older literature that gave me an edge as an applicant. So I was thinking about stories in a different way. And at the same time, I was also working on generating stories. So I like to say that it is not about the degree you have, which is absolutely true, but it is about your portfolio. It is about what you can show that you know how to do. So for me, that came through in a variety of ways. In one way, it came through with the Mediculum podcast, because I was very actively breaking down stories and then building up game design and saying, hey, this is how I do this. This is how I want to share this with the rest of the world. I had a background in production in doing that. I had a background in game design doing that. I had a background in deadlines, understanding the parameters of game design, those sorts of things. So all of those skills built into a very good portfolio piece there. I also created homebrew D&D stuff, and that also gave me the ability to learn how to write for games effectively, because game writing and traditional narrative novel writing, for instance, are two totally different crafts. In game writing, you have to do a lot of dialogue, and you have to be able to explain context in a very concise amount of time in very, very few words. You don't get to have long descriptions. You don't get to, you know, describe the environment, because the player is in the environment, right? So through all of those things, through practicing the craft and building a portfolio, along with having this background and degree that I turned into a strength, I was able to pave my way and show that this is something I want to do, this is something I'm good at, and jump into the industry. But really, you do have to pave your own way. There's not a very clear way to do it. You can't just grab a degree and go. But the fun part of all of that is that you get to do the thing you love in the creation of that portfolio and in doing those applications. So for me, it was a very fun process. And so I'd encourage those who are looking into jumping down that rabbit hole to continue to build their portfolio, continue to get better, because that is the best way you can prove your skills.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think that's just good advice in general. If you want to become a programmer, you want to become an artist or writer like yourself, you know, just keep honing your skills. Doesn't matter if, you know, your attempts aren't the best, because, you know, they will get better. That's just inevitable. And, you know, just build up your portfolio. I know I have this conversation with a lot of people, and they're at the start afraid of putting their stuff out there. Let's say if it's programming, putting it on GitHub, because they feel like it's not good enough, and they're going to be judged for that, and as a result, not be able to get a job. And my advice always is, you're more likely not to get the job if you don't showcase your, you know, your basic stuff, and then your stuff that's a bit better than the stuff that's a little bit better than that, to show that transition from becoming a basic programmer to someone that's a bit more competent. So yeah,
Exactly.
definitely you build up your portfolio and hone your skills. So
Yeah. And
what
share
are
it.
Oh yeah, should definitely sharing. And there's different ways of sharing. You got YouTube now. You got this form that we're on in podcast form. You might really like that. You've got blogs as well. Obviously, there's just posting it onto something like GitHub. Obviously, I'm sure there'll be equivalent platforms for sharing writing
Yep.
outside of your own blog. So there'll be platforms for anything really, and you can create online courses as well. I think that's also a good way to hone your skills once you get to an okay, decent enough level where you can learn as you're going along, plus teach others as well, and that'll make you think about it in a slightly different way, because you have to be very concise when you're teaching if you want to be a good teacher. So if usually you take a bit of time or the process isn't quite refined, you'll end up just refining it as you're teaching it. So that's another option as well.
Definitely. Definitely.
So what are some of your favorite medieval games, movies, and TV shows?
Oh gosh.
Go crazy.
Let's see. Well, the tricky thing about that is that it's very, very difficult to find instances where the medieval world is shown in a realistic way. So let's see. Games, TV shows, movies. Um, I mean, it's probably a cop out, but Pentiment is my favorite medieval game.
Okay.
I will say that The Witcher 3, even though it's technically a fantasy game, does a fantastic job of incorporating a lot of that Polish folklore.
Yeah.
Also, a lot of the folklore of Ireland, England, that sort of thing, in with it. Like, for instance, the Skellige Isles are based off of Irish folklore, essentially, Irish and Scottish folklore. So a lot of that comes through. And so I think that's my favorite depiction of the medieval world outside of Pentiment, simply because they treat it with excellence and they take some liberties, but the liberties that they do take, I think, are true to the spirit of the series, rather than trying to be very strict with, this is how we're going to depict the medieval world, blah, 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 blah. Therefore, we're going to show some of these problematic issues of the medieval world or things like that. So I think the Witcher series does a fantastic job with that. Let's see. Movies and TV shows. Funnily enough, the Vinland Saga anime does a fantastic job of representing the Viking or Icelandic sagas, which I think is fantastic, phenomenal. Obviously, it is an anime, so you expect those same tropes throughout. But for instance, they do a better job of depicting the Viking world than the Vikings TV show does. So I didn't expect that out of an anime, but it was wonderfully surprising to see. And then as far as film goes, I think some of the inspirations for Pentiment actually are wonderful examples. So we've got Andrei Rublev, which is a Russian film about an artist who creates this big, beautiful church bell. It's mostly, I think it's all in black and white. Beautiful film. There's also The Return of Martin Guerre, which is based off of a real court case in France. That does a fantastic job of depicting the medieval world. And then one of my favorites, which does not do a super accurate depiction, but it's funny and it's weird, is Colin Firth starring in a film called The Advocate. And this film is about a lawyer, Colin Firth, who has to defend a pig in a trial for like killing a young boy. And this is called an animal trial, and animal trials were actually a real thing in the medieval world. and this it ranged from, your donkey kicked my wife, we're gonna take the donkey to court, for instance, or hey, there's a swarm of locusts and they're eating our crops, we're gonna take the swarm of locusts to court, and then the court banishes them from the city, and that's how you settled this dispute. And because it was such an ecclesiastical world, such a spiritual world, they believed that, okay, the locusts are actually going to leave the town. Our town will be safe. So it's a very strange phenomenon, and it's fun to see on screen. And it's also just weird to see Colin Firth in this position as this medieval lawyer. So that's just a fun one. So those are probably my favorite.
I mean, I haven't heard about that movie before, but I'm definitely gonna check it out. I mean, I never heard about that sort of idea as well. Suing animals and like that actually happening. So I'm guessing, let's say if they sued the donkey or they took it to court, and then the donkey lost, what they would just take the donkey out to the city or the town boundaries and just leave it there. Is that what they would do?
It really depended. There were some, like, sure, exile could be one way to do it. Other times they would hang the donkey, or just kill it, or sometimes the donkey would be sold. Like, it really depends on what the actual case is. But it's very strange to think that they, went about this sort of ritualistic court case, but it was one way that the medieval folks at this time sort of rationalized understanding how bad things happen to them and what they can do to find justice. Okay. So it's a weird phenomenon, which makes sense for them, but looking at it from a 21st century perspective is very strange.
Oh yeah. And would it be entirely on the animal? So let's say if the donkey kicked a boy and then they took the donkey to court, would there still be some responsibility to the animal's owner, aka the donkey's owner in this case? Or is it purely we are punishing or absolving the animal itself?
That depends by the case. So in some instances, because animal trials are sort of a niche thing in of themselves. For instance, they're not common in Scandinavia. Then it would just be the donkey's owner versus the kid who, like, if the kid goes inside the pen and gets kicked, that's his own fault, and you wouldn't really have a court case. But if the donkey was not supposed to be there or whatever, then it would be the owner's case, and they would take that up with the owner. So it really depends on the culture, the time period, a whole bunch of different stuff.
Okay. And so, talking about games, what do you love about the gaming art form compared to music and movies?
Ooh. To me, I love the interactivity of it. With film in particular, it's immersive, but it's less immersive because you're sort of in this role of a voyeur. You're watching everything that happens, and you can be gripped by what is going on. And I think in film, for instance, you have more room to get inside characters' heads. You can do monologues. You can have, little insights into characters' minds that you don't get as much in games. But at the end of the day, you're still watching all of this happen. You're not experiencing it for yourself. And so games, I think, have this incredible ability to allow the player, the consumer, the, however you want to say it, reader in a sense, to be a part of that story and affect it. And that's something that I feel is incredibly, incredibly unique to games themselves. And this sort of, to me, goes back to the oral tradition of storytelling, where, for instance, in the story of Troy and Homer telling the story over and over again, or Beowulf, for instance, this story was told 1,000 times. It changed 1,000 times. before it was codified and written down, essentially. And so in that sense, it's a little bit like D&D, where you're creating a story together. And so for me, video games combine all the best parts of that tradition, the oral storytelling tradition, the D&D, TTRPG tradition, but also incorporate the incredible technological, advances of film, cinema, and music in those ways, and just push all of that together to create an incredibly immersive experience that the player gets so caught up in that, to me, it supersedes a lot of any other types of narrative, because you're allowing the player to choose where to go, what to do, within a framework, of course, to provide a satisfying story. But because the player is the one choosing or the one experiencing it, I think it affects people more and gives people a greater sense of agency and reminds them that, oh, my actions matter, both in and out of game. And to me, that's a totally new level of narrative we've never seen before, and that really grabs me.
Oh yeah, like because gaming is my favorite art form as well. The immersion that you have, because depending on the game, but you shape the game world, you shape your character, and obviously in some games you physically are shaping your character. You choosing, male or female. You choosing, height. You choosing hair, skin color, all that sort of stuff. So you're really creating your own, person in that game and interacting. And then when you have,
Yep.
different options for dialogue as well, because in a movie it's just whatever the dialogue is, whatever the characters. If a character dies at the 1 hour mark, he or she dies always at the 1 hour mark.
Yep.
There's no change in that. And when you have some games like Heavy Rain and Detroit Becoming Human,
Mm-hmm.
where certain people, you can save them from dying, or
Yeah.
some of your decisions, they could die earlier on in the game, and then the game just keeps going. Having that sort of experience and the replayability as well is obviously on another level.
Yeah.
Where do
It's
you think
phenomenal.
where do you think something like VR, plays a part, if at all, in a more immersive, narrative storytelling perspective?
Oh gosh. I mean, VR, I would love to see more VR. Two, it's an incredibly difficult thing to produce and do still at this time.
Mm.
But I would love to see more of that. And I think we can get a lot more environmental storytelling through things like VR, because the player usually is doing this from a first person perspective, not a third person perspective. They're seeing everything, they're feeling like they're experiencing everything. And so you can hide a lot more storytelling in the environment and in the context of what is going on. And what I mean by that is, for instance, in Half-Life Alyx, I think I spent like 4 hours not even doing the initial mission, just walking around, picking things up, looking at things, understanding what the context of this world is. Because I had not played any other Half-Life games before. So this was my first introduction to that world, and it was through VR. And so everything that I was doing was telling a story. And that's the part that I love about video game storytelling. And a lot of that is through environment design. And so that is partly my job, but also the area designer's job, the artist's job, the audio designer's job. Everybody is working on this, lighting, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like I said at the beginning, it's my job as a narrative designer to be an advocate for that. So to see Half-Life Alyx and walk around like that initial room and be able to pick up the whiteboard markers and draw on the windows and turn around and tap on the little like glowing bug and have it react, be able to walk around, play with the switches and touch things, was so incredible to me. And as I was doing all of this, I could, for instance, put my hand up on the wall and, sort of touch it in a sense. And so I think the next best ways that we can use narrative in VR would be to add little environmental things that add to the story, that add to the narrative in reactivity ways. So for instance, like we can use Half-Life Alyx as an example, or any other kind of game. What if you were able to physically reach out and tear down propaganda posters, right? And this is something that the game perhaps does not even tell you to do. You can just take the initiative as the player to reach out and pull down propaganda posters. And in the background, the game might be tallying how many you have torn down. And so maybe you get a quest out of that, like, hey, you've been tearing these down. We're seeing you tear these down. Will you help us overcome this, propaganda printer, whatever? Or maybe the bad guys find you and say, like, hey, we know you're tearing down these posters. You're a problem, or whatever. And so I think that's one way you can use narrative and the environment in VR to your advantage in a way that we can't quite do yet outside of that. So for instance, in a third-person video game or even a first-person video game, like Skyrim, you'd have to walk up to the wall and you'd have like X to interact, tear poster. Cool. Then you tear the poster down. But that is very, very obvious to the player. Like, ooh, this is a quest. There's something here to do. But in VR, because everything is so immersive, you don't have the indicator of click X to interact. You can just interact. And so by taking away that little extra piece of UI, you further immerse the player. And when you further immerse the player, they don't know whether their choices matter. And when they don't know whether their choices matter, the stakes are higher. So I think that's really one way that it could be very, very interesting to play with VR.
Oh yeah, I mean, I do love it when games in general, not just in VR, add extra parts of the game where you can go to certain parts of, the game world or the level, and there's nothing actually there to do. But there's a room that you have no business being there. There's nothing to collect, no mission to do. But you can go in there because that's how the actual world will be if it actually existed. Yep. Or you can interact and pick stuff up. And again, they might not provide any utility. So some RPG games, you can pick up an item, put it into your inventory, and you'll literally say that it's useless and it has no value. But you can store that item. You might even be able to sell it or utilize it for some sort of creation or potion. But you can store that. When you're able to do that, it does take you beyond a surface level environment. And I do like the idea of being able to tear down the posters, maybe able to rip them up. Now when we've got hand tracking as well, instead of having to use like the Knuckles controllers on the Valve Index or any sort of controllers, you can just grab the poster yourself literally with your hand potentially and pull it down. So that's definitely something. And then even beyond that, like in Half-Life Alyx, where you have those pens, imagine if you stored those pens and instead of taking down the poster, you drew on it, and
exactly.
maybe that triggers something different compared to pulling down the posters. And maybe it also depends on if people notice you pulling down the posters. If you do it when nobody notices you, maybe you don't get that mission because nobody knows it was you. You might get dialogue in the background, but nobody knows it was you.
Yep. Yeah, there's so many different narrative options that become a possibility. There's so many different gameplay options that become a possibility when you start incorporating that extra immersion of VR that I'm very excited to see.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Half-Life Alyx is my favorite VR experience by far. I've played, used a bunch of headsets, played, a ton of VR games, and Half-Life Alyx is the most complete VR experience that feels like a game that's not a technical demo. Because I find a lot of VR games, though they're good, they feel like a technical demo, and they don't feel like a game. But obviously, this had the storyline. It was obviously linked to a rich world prior to that, and it was long as well, because obviously you get many VR games that are very short, like the full game might be 20 hours if it's just generally outside of VR, then the VR version 6 or 7 hours, whereas I can't remember the amount of time that Half-Life Alyx was, but it was a long time just for the core gameplay.
Yeah.
And that really helps as well. Did you go and play the other Half-Life games afterwards or not?
Not yet. I currently haven't even finished Half-Life Alyx.
Okay.
But I'm very excited to, and I think like as you were saying, like a lot of them do feel like technical demos because I think we're still at just the bleeding edge of this
Mm.
technology, and we're sort of waiting or developing this, and in the next 20 years, who knows what that's going to look like. And so I'm very excited to see where that goes, especially from a narrative perspective, because I think we're very, very focused on that technical side right now, but the things you could do with narrative, I think, have not been explored yet.
Oh yeah, definitely. And when you bring in the possibility for other people interacting with the world, via some sort of online play as well, not necessarily just, player versus player, Call of Duty or anything like that, or Fortnite, where you have, let's say, some sort of rich world, you can walk around it, and maybe there's other players that can log into that server and interact with it, and based on what they do, the dialogue might change. So, an interactive RPG, and in VR, being able to potentially see characters or, avatars of people that in the real world, that definitely has some, potential immersion advantages as
Oh,
well, I think.
100%. Oh, yeah.
So, what headset are you using for Half-Life Alyx?
Right now, the Oculus.
The Oculus. I'm guessing one of the Quest headsets. That's one of the
Uh,
more popular ones.
I believe so. It's actually my fiance's. I am not super.
Is it the
It's
what?
so funny.
Is it like the self-contained wireless one on its own that you can play games on its own? Not for
Oh
Half-Life
gosh.
Alyx, but just other games on there, like Beat Saber. Can you just install games on
Yeah,
the? Yeah, so it's probably a Quest. Is it black or white?
it's white.
Yeah, it'll be Quest 2 then. So yeah,
Perfect.
I mean,
Yep.
the Quest definitely. I mean, I haven't seen the exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure the Quest is the best-selling VR headset of all time,
I'd
and
expect
obviously
so.
the price point and the fact that you can just have it untethered and you can get a decent experience because Medal of Honor is on there now, Sniper Elite VR is on there. You can get a great experience and you can take it anywhere you want, but then you can just plug it in with a cable and play stuff like Half-Life. I mean, you can even do it wirelessly if you've got a good router, to be fair. But if you want the good,
Hmm.
the nice, smooth experience for the most part, then you want the cable option. And then you can play games like Half-Life Alyx. Another game I would recommend once you've done Half-Life Alyx is Lone Echo 1 and 2 on PC.
All right.
And that's made by, I'm pretty sure Oculus themselves made that, or like they have a studio that made that game,
Oh,
and that's a
fantastic.
very rich and deep experience. I won't spoil it, but you're in a space station, so you're in zero gravity a lot of the time,
Oh, that is
and
so cool.
you're using your hands, the controllers, to grab onto objects, and if you pull it towards you and let go, you fly through the environment.
Oh, that is very cool.
Yeah, so
I'll definitely have to check that out.
yeah, the graphics for that is also very good because obviously I'm sure you can tell that the graphics for Half-Life Alyx are also very good.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So, what's it like working for Obsidian as a part of Xbox?
Oh gosh. I mean, I have so much fun just every single day. And I was not a part of Obsidian before it became an Xbox studio, but I can tell you that Pentiment would not have happened at all if we did not become an Xbox studio and we were given the opportunity to kind of pursue this smaller indie style game. So having the freedom to do that was just absolutely incredible because it was a very, very small team that we were working with. I was one of three writers on the project, and we basically have been given the ability to go where we want with it and do what we want with it, which has just been incredible. So the Xbox team has just been fantastic when it comes to promoting Pentiment and getting me connected with folks like you to talk about it, but also when it comes to how Pentiment even came to be and how much freedom they gave us with it. It was just phenomenal all the way around.
Okay, that's good to hear. I mean, that's definitely something I've noticed with Microsoft and Xbox in more recent years. They, a lot of the stuff they've done and bringing companies in, they haven't gotten in the way too much, and they've let them do their own thing, because they bought not Microsoft, they bought Minecraft, and Minecraft's been ticking away and doing their own thing. I don't think Minecraft has been stifled as a result of the purchase. I know a bunch of people were concerned about that, but that seems to be fine. And obviously time will tell how it works out with Bethesda, Obsidian, and these companies like that. But so far it seems to, in my eyes, everything seems to be ticking away nicely on, from the gamer's perspective and from Microsoft's perspective. So, hats off to Microsoft for, not getting in the way, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the big things, especially in this industry and in this field, is you want to be able to give the creators on the ground the ability and the freedom to do what they're best at, but you also need the infrastructure to support that. And that's a very tricky balance to achieve. And I think they've done a fantastic job with Pentiment on that. So
Oh
that's
yeah.
been very, very reassuring for our team.
So, as Xbox owns many game studios and they're, acquiring more by the day, it seems, is there, ever any crossover to easily jump, from one role in one studio to another studio, or are they literally closed entities?
We're pretty independent as far as studios go. I can't really speak to that at the moment. I just because I'm not the expert on that topic, so I can't really speak to it. But we essentially operate as our own studio, and yeah, there's not a whole lot of crossover that I'm aware of. But again, I'm a narrative designer, you know, working on my project. So all of that stuff is far above my level or on the communications team. And essentially, Xbox and Microsoft help a lot more with the behind the scenes stuff and just allow us to do what we need to do as a studio, which is make great games.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds like, what I was just saying before, where, they get out the way and they just help when the help's needed, which is good.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
what's your favorite Xbox game and your favorite game in general?
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Um Favorite Xbox game. I don't actually know at the moment because I've never been much of a console person.
Or,
Uh,
or the favorite game that's owned by Microsoft slash Xbox. So,
oh
because they own
man,
a lot of studios now and a lot of games, so that should open it up a bit more.
it should, yeah. Um, that's tricky for me because I had a PlayStation growing up, so I played a lot of PlayStation games, and only recently in the past couple of years have played more Xbox games, and most of the stuff now that I play is on my console. Let's see. Man, I mean, I think hmm. See, I probably couldn't even tell you which console or which game belongs to what console.
Okay, then how about, favorite games then?
Gosh, okay. Let's see. Favorite games. I mean, Pentiment in general is just fantastic. I will say I think one of the most immersive fun games that I have played that I know is on Xbox is Outer Worlds just because it's such a cool new sci-fi universe, and that just grabbed me instantly. So that's definitely up there. Other fantastic games. Witcher is one of my favorite games, again, because it balances that wonderful narrative fantasy with history. I think Last of Us is also narratively just phenomenal. Other games I really like. I'm always a sucker for Animal Crossing. So that one's always fun for, like, you know, being on a plane for several hours. But I generally lean towards very narrative heavy games. So anything that has a strong narrative bent where choices matter. So obviously Pentiment to me was just so fun to work on, so fun to play. Things like Outer Worlds, things like Pillars. Dragon Age is a longtime favorite. Think so. Anything within that realm.
Okay. And what video game are you looking forward to?
Oh gosh, looking forward to. Trying to think of up and coming. I'm terrible for someone who works in the industry. I'm so busy working on games that I don't keep track of everything that's coming out. Let's see. Games that I'm excited about. Gosh, I mean, it's already come out, but I haven't really played Stray yet, so I'm very excited about that.
That was good. I mean,
So
I haven't completed it yet. I'm probably more than halfway. I mean, I like that they gave it for free on PlayStation. So that really, I would have bought it anyway because my wife loves cats, and
oh yes,
I would have bought it just for her. Otherwise, I would have been on the fence about it. But it is good. It looks good, and I like it when they do different games like that. You know, it's just different. Because I remember, again, not made by the same people, but it's made by, I think, that game company. Do you remember Flower and Journey? Or have you heard of them?
I loved Journey, absolutely. I haven't played Flower. I did play Abzu, and I think that was done by the same folks.
Yeah, so like I remember playing those games. They just feel different and feel very relaxing. Like some games
Yes,
can, take, the load, you load off and just give you a good time, but those games, if it just feels like you're floating on a cloud almost.
yes.
It's a very relaxing game, and they're very different. Have you ever played a game called Firewatch?
I love Firewatch. Yes,
That's such a good game as well, and
that one's
it's so
fantastic.
different.
Yeah, and I love smaller games like that because they offer an entirely different kind of immersive experience. Like, don't get me wrong, the big games, like God of War and like the call outs, wow, Call of Duties and Fallouts, those games phenomenal. Love those games, but there's something so different, and there's, I think, a little bit more heart in those smaller games like Abzu and Firewatch, at least narratively, like story wise, that really are interesting to me.
Oh yeah, definitely. And because I think part of it is you can get one or two people that could create an amazing narrative that can, on let's say a small scale, compete with, let's say, a big title. But for them to compete technically, you're not going to get a couple of people realistically make a game that's going to compete with Grand Theft Auto or Fallout or Call of Duty, these sort of titles, or Half-Life Alyx, for example. It's just not going to happen. So they have to do, some other stuff. And I think narrative, certain gameplay elements is definitely those things that they can do, make them feel really good. And they usually have like a very sort of simplistic and unique art style that makes it look very nice without it having to be technically complex.
Yes, absolutely. And for that, I guess, boundary, that a lot of smaller studios or indie devs have to struggle with. I think that breeds a lot of innovation that I would love to see more of at larger studios. And I absolutely think it's there. Um, and I would love to see sort of more of that back and forth where smaller studios have the technical ability to play around with those big ideas, and a lot of the bigger studios get to play around with some of the smaller, more innovative ideas, which I think is what we did with Pentiment. Um, so I would love to see more of that crossover.
Yeah, I mean, I do love it when they do, people release a good indie game, and it's just fun in a different way compared,
Oh
like,
yeah.
you got games like Inside, and I'm trying to think what the game before Limbo, as well. It's a sort of type of game you generally don't get from the bigger, studios, and sometimes they sell really well as well.
Definitely.
So, what's your favorite board game? Because I'm guessing Dungeons and Dragons style stuff, but what would you say?
Oh gosh. I really enjoy Weissen, which is a TTRPG. It's its own system. It's done by Free League, and it's set in turn of the 20th century Scandinavia, so late 1800s, early 1900s, where you as players are essentially investigators. You become part of the society, which is this ancient order that goes out and hunts Weissen. And Weissen are the supernatural creatures of Scandinavia. And so essentially it's The Witcher, but instead of set in, you know, weird medieval fantasy Europe, it's weird medieval fantasy 1900s Scandinavia. And it's just so much fun because you get to play around with the technology of the day of like electricity, vaccines, all this new industrial age coming up. And it's just such an interesting period and interesting time to play in, but it also relies more on using your wits and role playing ability to overcome ethical and moral questions, especially those surrounding what do you do with the monsters, the Weissen, who are being problems. So maybe they're spoiling milk, maybe they're making people sick, maybe it's a werewolf hunting people down, but maybe they have a good reason for it. And so it really brings up the question of who is really the monster in this scenario. And it brings questions of like the ethics of industrialization versus cottage industries and so on and so forth. It's just a fascinating world. Plus, you automatically get a headquarters in the system. And it's this big old castle that you get to explore and improve and renovate. And so to me, it's just a fascinating system that delves into the folklore that I'm already super interested in. So that's one of my favorite board games, TTRPGs, that I've ever played.
Okay. And how long does a typical game last? Are they long or are they short?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you and your, session want to do, but it's very much styled in like Monster of the Week sort of episodes or adventures. So you could do a whole bunch of one shots. You could make this into a very long campaign. You can have one adventure last several sessions. So it's very customizable in terms of what you want to do with it. So I really like it. I like the sort of Monster of the Week format. You get to go out and explore different areas in Scandinavia. They now have an expansion for Mythic Britain and Ireland. So that gets into a lot of the folklore of Ireland and Britain, Scotland, England, Wales. That's very interesting to me as well, especially because I got my degree and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you get to meet a bunch of these like legendary, both historical and fictional characters. So Sherlock Holmes is there, or Marie Curie or whoever. So you get to meet these different people as NPCs and interact with them. And like hunt the Loch Ness monster or whatever. It's very, very cool.
Okay, that definitely sounds. Yeah, I'm gonna have a Google of that after and watch some videos on YouTube to see
Oh, and it's
what it's
spelled
about.
Vaesen. So it's Bison, but it's that AE,
B.
VAE.
So
V.
BAE of E.
Yes.
VAEFEN. Okay, I've got that noted. Okay, I'll definitely have a look at some videos of people playing that and see what that's like. So, what would be the next few roles above narrative designer? Where could somebody, on a similar journey end up?
A good question. So there's a bunch of different ways you can kind of go with this. You can become a senior writer, senior narrative designer. You can lean more into production and that aspect. If you want to like manage teams and help folks there, ultimately. As Josh Sawyer did on his own career, he directed Pentiment. He became the director, obviously, and he's currently studio design director at Obsidian. And so he went from a writing position up into that directorial position, but you can also stick at being a senior writer and just get very, very good at your craft and be comfortable there if you don't want to do any kind of leadership position. You can, if you do want to go into leadership, you can sort of lean more into production and help the team, lead the team. You can be a lead narrative designer. So that would be the individual who's in charge of all of the rest of the narrative designers on any given project. So for smaller projects, maybe that's 2 or 3 people. For larger projects, maybe that's 6, 10, 15, which would be an absurd amount of writers for any game. But managing people, understanding what the narrative scope of the game is and what different tasks need to be assigned. So there's the cool part about game dev is that you can sort of pick your own path, pick your own adventure as you progress. And there's really cool opportunities to just sort of stay and hone your craft as a writer, to jump into leadership, to jump into direction. But there's a variety of ways to go with it.
Okay, fair enough. And on Pentiment, how many narrative, designers are there?
We had 3 in total. So we had Josh as our director. He did a bit of the writing. There
Mm-hmm.
was Kate Dollarhide, who was my predecessor, who stepped off of the project to pursue her own work. There was myself, and then we had Merton also come in as a contractor towards the end to help out as we polished things up toward the end. So ultimately, we had 3, 4 writers in total on the project who sort of stepped in at different times, just depending on where we needed them and what stage of the project we were at.
Okay, and how many are currently there right now, including yourself?
At the moment, myself and Josh.
Okay, so just 2 people. Do you know
Yep.
how many narrative designers would be on a game like Fallout or Elder Scrolls? Because obviously that's a lot, a lot bigger.
I would estimate between 5 to 10 for a game of that size. Typically, narrative is, I wouldn't necessarily say understaffed, but narrative requires fewer people
Mm-hmm.
than other departments. So the engineers, the programmers, we need a bunch of them. Area designers, we need a bunch of them. But narrative, you don't want too many cooks stirring the pot, essentially, because that can cause a lot of problems. But you do want enough people to be able to cover all of the regions that you're working on, all of the quests that you're working on, and everything like that. So Pentiment didn't need a lot of narrative designers because it was a fairly straightforward story. But on larger games like Fallout, like Elder Scrolls has like probably over 1,000 quests. So you need a whole bunch of writers to go in, create those, so on and so forth. But the thing that I want to emphasize here is that it's not just about the writers, because on, for instance, quests, you have to balance that work with your area designer or your region designer, because there's various titles for these different roles. Different studios have different names for them. At Obsidian, they're area designers, and narrative designers work with, or NDs work with ADs, the area designers, collaboratively and with our artists to create the world for that quest. So if it's a very, very small quest, maybe that means, oh, we need to stick an NPC down by the boat, and you need to be able to talk with them, and let's stick some barrels next to him, and that looks good. That's all we need to do for that. Or if it's part of the crit path, for instance, okay, well, you need a whole lot more there. So you have to work with them a whole lot more on, okay, I need this character to trigger this dialogue at this moment, but not if the player doesn't have, this object in their inventory. So there's a lot of conditionals, there's a lot of variables that go along with that. So even though you have, for instance, fewer narrative designers on a given project, the narrative designers are actively working with the area designers on all of this stuff all of the time. So even though the department for narrative might be smaller, the people working on any quest or working on the narrative, that number is going to be larger.
Okay, fair enough. And in terms of the role, is it remote or office based?
It can be both. I am currently working remote. We do have people who are in the office. It is very project intensive. So no matter what, you need to be in your office. You need to be working on these things. You can't really get up and go to a coffee shop to work on this stuff because the database in the project is so big. So you can work remote, you can work in office, but no matter what you're doing, you will be at your desk, you will be in those meetings and churning out all of that material. But honestly, it's so much fun. I love doing it.
Yeah, I can imagine. So talking about meetings, how much of a narrative designer's role is meeting based?
Depends on where we're at in the project, to be honest. There are, I guess, different waves of the project where, for instance, the very beginning of it will be a lot of meetings where you sit down, you talk with the director, you talk with your narrative lead about what the game is, what quests you want to have. You have to brainstorm the quests, you have to brainstorm the NPCs, you have to brainstorm, everything. And so that part of the game is basically all meetings, because you're throwing a bunch of people who are very creative, very smart into a room together and saying, come up with something great. So it's like one big, massive party. It's fantastic. And then later, when you get into doing that writing, you don't have a lot of meetings. It's very much, heads down, let's churn this material out. I love both parts of the process, and it's so fun to sit in a room with all these people and throw ideas out and say, no, that one sucks, but this one I really like, or no, I don't know about this one, or, oh, that idea is fantastic, we absolutely need to have that, whatever that looks like. And then turning and taking that material and writing it out and iterating on it. So starting from a first draft and then making it better is fantastic. And in between those sections, there are meetings there. So for instance, when you write a first draft, you send it out to the other narrative designers and you send it out to the area designers and say, hey, can you play through this? Can you read through this? Does that line suck? Does that line read well? Does that fit? Do I need to change this? You get a bunch of that feedback back and forth. So meetings are essential, but it's not so much that you're sitting there in a meeting and hearing a lecture or having talking points thrown at you. It's very, very collaborative, where you're sitting down with people and saying, hey, I'm working on this quest, and I think it would be really cool if you mentioned this quest in your quest, and go back and forth. Let's get some reactivity here. Let's work together, collaborate on this. And so there are a lot of meetings, but they're pretty fun.
Okay. And did you always want to be a narrative designer, or did you think about something else in the gaming industry?
I didn't necessarily think about anything else in the gaming industry, simply because when I was growing up, I thought that to do anything in the gaming industry, you had to know how to code. So I'm very relieved that that is not the case. And I've learned, I've learned what I need to do for my work, but I'm very glad that I don't need to learn, C++ or Python or JavaScript or any of those, because frankly, I'm terrible at it. But initially, I was not even thinking about being a narrative designer at all. I knew that I wanted to be a writer because I'd been writing for as long as I could hold a pencil, and I just didn't know what that would look like. So a lot of that for me is creative writing. I still do that in my own spare time. A lot of that was game design, TTRPGs, and playing those, homebrewing things myself, working on the Maniculum podcast, things like that. And then once I had the idea of, oh, maybe I could do this as a game developer, I sort of ran down that path. And what made that very appealing to me was the fact that game narratives are, in my opinion, the most cutting edge type of narrative that we have. And we already talked about that quite a bit, especially in regards to VR. But I was so obsessed with that idea that I just sort of ran at it, and I just said, okay, I'm just, it's COVID. I was supposed to go on to do another degree in academia, but that unfortunately was stopped because of COVID. And so I said, okay, I have a year to figure out what I want to do. Let me just run at game development and see what sticks. And it's the best decision that I could have ever made.
Okay. So what was that other degree that you was going to go on to doing?
That would have been a degree in Viking studies at the University of Iceland and University of Oslo. So that would have been a secondary master's degree.
I mean, I've never heard of that degree before. That definitely sounds like you're preparing for Valhalla there.
Oh yeah, 100%.
So, what mistakes did you make, along the way on your journey, and what would you do differently? And as a result, what advice would you give to others?
Ooh, great question. First things first, I was scared to put things out there. I was scared to share my material. I didn't really know how to, I mean, they call it networking. I really don't like that term because that makes me think of like people in suits, and game dev is quite informal. So I I was very nervous about reaching out to people and talking to people. And once I did, I realized current developers are more than happy to share their expertise and their knowledge, and they would love to. So, first things first, put your stuff out there, and ask for advice, ask for feedback, and be polite when you reach out to current developers. And, you know, don't ask for a lot of their time. We're incredibly busy all of the time, but something like, hey, can I have just a 30-minute conversation with you about what your journey was and what I can do? Or, hey, can you, take 5 minutes to look at my resume and, give me advice or whatever. Generally speaking, if you are polite and you are kind and you don't ask for much, we will give you so much in return. So be polite. And if you get a no, accept the no, be very professional about it. But also just putting things out there and sharing them with friends, with family, on the internet, things like that. Like putting your stuff out on GitHub, letting people play with it is huge. And I am a person who's very perfectionist in a lot of ways. And so I felt like unless it's polished, unless it's perfect, I can't put it out. And I'm telling you, put it out anyway. Just go for it. Because whatever you do at first, it's gonna suck. And that's totally okay. And the sooner you can acknowledge that and put it out there, the sooner you're going to get better. And this is the concept of doing quantity over quality. So the more that you put out there, the better and faster you are going to improve and get that quality. But if you sit there and you worry over it over and over and over and over again, you're not going to get where you want to go. And that also goes for applications. So once you have that portfolio and once you have that resume started, start applying. Start applying, start asking for feedback, start practicing, and don't wait until you feel like you're qualified, because I promise you, you will never feel like you are qualified. I still get imposter syndrome to this day, and Pentiment got fantastic ratings. Like, we're nominated for a BAFTA, and I still struggle with feeling like I'm not that good of a writer, or I'm still making this up as I go. And so, sometimes that feeling won't go away. And so the best thing you can do is to just go for it and put that out there. Another thing that I think I made mistakes on early in the process was not communicating enough. So once I was hired and I was a part of Obsidian, I was, and I think this does come a lot from academia, is I was worried about getting in trouble, and so I felt like I had to figure it out.
Yeah, that's definitely the case with academia, and
Oh yeah,
and when you get into the real world, you find you can get in trouble, but it's not the same thing, because I've wrote a few programming books, and I'm in the process of writing a programming book now. And when I was just describing, something, yeah, I was like, it's already been described before. I'll just grab a description of like the official docs online, and
mm-hmm.
I grabbed that, and obviously it's plagiarism. But I thought it's only describing a feature in a programming language, and because it's a Swift programming book, Apple's put it out there. I don't see anything wrong with that per se. And the publisher, when they checked it out, they said that they literally just put it out. They said, plagiarism, flagged it up. Can you just rewrite it, please? That was it. As long as you rewrite it, they don't care. Whereas at uni, it would have been a big deal. That probably, if you had they would have pulled you to the side, had a meeting with you, and then you would have had to try and deny it to get out of it. Whereas in the real world, they're like, just rewrite it so no one knows, basically.
Yeah. And yeah, like, as long as you put a good faith effort forward and you do your job, everyone's okay with you asking questions, especially because as you onboard into game dev, everyone's going to know you've never worked with our systems before. You don't know how our system works. And they expect you to be asking those questions. So, and that goes for any, first job that you go into, especially for game dev, because every single studio has their own way of doing things. So it's 100% okay to ask those questions. So I, at first, did not communicate enough because I felt like I had to do it on my own. And so when you do get that position, or when you're applying and you have a question, and don't feel like you can't reach out to that recruiter and say, hey, I want some clarification on this, or hey, reach out to your supervisor and say, hey, I'm really struggling with understanding how to, like, for me, it's like how to download, Paraforce, or how to work Jira or whatever. I'm not good at that technical stuff. And so I think with that, it's like, look at your ego in the face and tell it to sit down, because it's okay to ask for help. So that was another mistake that I made. I felt like I had to do it all on my own, which is not true. You definitely don't have to do this all on your own.
Yeah,
So.
and I find like the thing that you get in your head that people will judge me too much. Yeah, people do judge. I've judged people, and I'm sure they've judged me, but it doesn't really matter. When you realize that people are too busy in their lives and too busy thinking that they're going to get judged to really judge you in a way that actually makes a difference in your
Oh yeah.
life. So, just put the stuff out there. And I can attest to what you were saying before about, be respectful, reach out to someone, people are willing to help. Because that's how, Zoe came on the podcast. I literally just messaged, Zoe on LinkedIn, and from there we set a date and time, and here we are recording the podcast. And that's how most of my guests have come about. Whereas, because the initial, I don't know, 5 or 6 episodes were people that are new, and obviously that can only take you so far. And then I was like, okay, I'll message people on LinkedIn, because there's so many people on LinkedIn. There's so many people that work at these companies like Obsidian, like Microsoft, like PlayStation, all these companies, and I'm sure there's bound to be some that are willing to talk. There'll be plenty that won't respond, and again, it's a numbers game. If you just keep throwing enough basketballs, you're bound to get one in the hoop, and that's what you need to keep doing. Just keep messaging people. It's the same as if you're trying to get a job. Keep sending your CV out. If you just send it to one company, let's say it's Xbox, you're not setting yourself up for a good position. But if you send it to Xbox, send it to PlayStation, you send it to Rockstar, Nintendo, wherever, you send it enough times, you're gonna get a response. And what you'll find is, even if the response is not what you want, if you're willing to adapt and learn, you can get a nugget of information. And sometimes I've found when somebody responds and says no, and sometimes I'll try and push it, but sometimes all the time I'll just ask him, like, why? Like, I'll say nicely that I understand, but can you just give me some feedback? Because sometimes it might be me asking that, they say, I'm a bit busy right now, I might have some time in a couple of months. Then I put it in my calendar, 2 months, message this person. Whereas if I didn't ask, it would have just been a flat out no, or they give some advice, and I'm like, okay, I could take that for messaging the next person. So definitely be willing to ask. If you don't ask, you don't get. And the reality is, nobody's going to pull out a gun if you ask, things like this. Worst case, you get a bit of rejection, and I find most of the time the rejection is absent. It's like the lack of a response.
Yeah, usually. And one thing that I will say, and I find this helps folks a lot, is when I was applying for narrative designer roles, I had a 2% response rate. That is to say, I got an interview one every 50 applications that I put in. So if your numbers look similar, that's okay. You could expect those numbers. This is a hard industry to break into. You're not doing anything wrong necessarily if those are your numbers. You just have to get used to that rejection, and eventually you're gonna get that moment.
Oh yeah, you will. It's going to happen. It literally is a numbers game. Whether it's a job, whether you're reaching out to work with people, whether it's relationships. If you just keep at it, you will eventually get what you want, or get something good enough. Some alternative, something else will come. But you gotta be willing to put yourself out there, have a bit of embarrassment. Which in reality, when you look back, and what I always think is, what was that thing that I was embarrassed or felt a bit, not bad about, but felt a bit awkward about a year ago? And the reality is, I can't remember. It's not even that you won't feel bad about it or feel awkward about it in a year. You won't even remember, what it was. That time that you, did something silly accidentally in front of someone, or you said something, and most of the time you just don't remember. So knowing that time will literally just erase it is definitely a powerful motivator.
Definitely. Be courageous.
Oh yeah, for sure. So obviously I've asked you for advice on becoming a narrative designer, but what would be your advice for getting into the gaming industry specifically? You've been in there now, not just as a narrative designer, it could be a programmer, an artist, anything really.
Honestly, my advice would still be the same. As I said at the beginning, it is less important what degree you get and more important what skills you can show. I like to say that competency is key. So even if you, because a lot of people feel like, oh, well, I didn't get a degree in this, so I can't do it. Okay, that's fine. Nobody makes a degree for narrative design. And sure, you can get a programming degree, but that doesn't mean you're, going to be great for gaming. That's not a gaming degree. But honestly, a lot of the gaming degrees that exist right now are still in their infancy, and different studios want different things. So don't even worry about that. So if you do have a degree, a games degree, awesome, fantastic. But if you don't let that stop you. Build a good portfolio, whether that's GitHub, ArtStation, Narrative, whatever that is. Build a good portfolio, keep practicing, keep getting better, and keep applying.
Oh yeah, for sure. Just keep iterating on the process. It is, and that's life in general. Every year, just keep working on something, whether it's the same project, a new project, something at work, something in life. You just keep at it. It's like if you're trying to lose weight, you don't lose, let's say, 10 kilos overnight. You lose a little bit and a little bit. Before you know it, you've lost the 10 kilos or more. And it's the same with becoming an excellent programmer, an excellent writer, an excellent artist. You just, hone those skills. But the only way that you can hone them is by trying and by achieving failure. Because once you've achieved failure, the only way is up. The only way you can go is to succeed.
Absolutely. And I would even say the only way you can really fail is to not try.
Yes. So yeah, that's definitely the ultimate form of failure. And for all society and a lot of people, it's easier for them to not try because they can kind of get away with saying, oh, if I did do it, I would be great at it, or, I would do it differently, or I would be better. But the reality is, if you try, it's still, far better than if you don't try. And that's just life in general.
Oh, yeah. My first quest sucked. My first podcast episode sucked. My first writing sucked. But it's better to start and to fail and realize where you actually are at, because that gives you a base from which to move forward.
Yeah, people just want to be perfect from the start. They just want to get it right from the start. Because I remember, because I make a lot of programming and videos on YouTube, and the first tutorial I released back in early 2014, because I had a iMac at the time, 27-inch iMac, and the resolution was 2560 by 1440, and nice resolution. I recorded the screen at that native resolution, at the way that I view it, no zoom, no nothing, and I was like, I'm recording at a nice high resolution, and I upload it, and I'm happy with it. 2 episodes go by, or 2 videos go by, and somebody comments, or a few people comment that we can't read it because it's it's just so big. Obviously, for me, at the native screen and it being full screen, I can obviously read it. But there's people that are viewing it on the laptop. They've got it, just half the screen. They've got it on their phone, and they're not going to be able to read what was originally on a 27-inch display. But without putting it out there and getting that feedback, and then by the 3rd video, that got better. And I remember, again, with the first video, my voice sounded so robotic, whereas once I listened to it, I put that video out there, that's still there. After I did that, the 2nd and the 3rd one, it drastically improved, just because I heard how I sounded, and I was like, okay, I need to improve this. And there was just a little slight shift in the way I presented myself. But if I didn't put myself out there, and I just kept saying, gotta make it perfect, gotta make it perfect, gotta make sure it's just great from the start, I wouldn't have put it out there and then figured out those things based on either feedback or my own review of the content.
Yep, absolutely.
Oh yeah. So that's most of my questions done. I've got a few fun generic questions now, if you're up for that.
Yeah, sure. I feel like we can fit a few in.
Okay, so would you rather run a 10-person company or a 1,000-person company, and why?
Oh, I'd rather run a 10-person company.
Okay, why?
Um, well, because bigger is not always better, and I feel like a lot of people forget that. And bigger means more overhead, more problems, um, more cost. There's so much stuff you'd have to do there. And I feel like with a 10-person company, you can focus on making something really, really good that matters. You can develop strong relationships with your team. Um, you can manage it a whole lot better. You've got, again, good relationships. To me, like, good relationships are everything when it comes to the creative arts and making a cohesive, I guess, product or game or story or whatever you're making. You need those relationships and you need to work with your individuals. And that's a lot easier to do on a 10-person team than a 1,000-person team. I wouldn't even know how to approach managing 1,000 people, but 10 people, I could probably do.
You can manage that. So, okay, so would you rather have $5 million up front or $500,000 a year for the rest of your life, and why?
$500,000. Because that would be an insane amount to live off of at all. And if it's for the rest of my life, then that would likely be more than 5 million in total over the course of my life, Lord willing. And then with that kind of income every single year, you could put that towards so many different projects, so many different causes, rather than a lump sum once.
Okay. And this is a question that I love asking all my guests. Does money buy you happiness, and why? And then on top of that, what does a good life mean to you?
Ooh, good question. Money can buy you happiness to a point. Money can buy you happiness in terms of it can buy you the things that you need to live a successful, happy life, covering your basic needs, being able to be generous to those around you, having the ability to, take time off or to cover emergency expenses. So I understand when people say money can't buy happiness, but it can to a point. I think there also comes a point when you have so much income, you start worrying about it, or you have so much funds. Like at a certain point, that's just more of a headache than it's worth. So it can to a point, and I feel like everybody's number there differs. Um, but yeah, so it can to a point. And then what was the second question?
It was, what does a good life mean to you?
Gosh, a good life. I would say a good life is a life in which I'm constantly growing and evolving as an individual and becoming the best person that I possibly can, and surrounding myself with people who share that goal.
Okay, that's good stuff. So yeah, I agree. When you was talking about the money side of things, it can, how yes, buy you happiness, but there comes to it comes to a certain point where it won't buy you anymore, and you've got to focus it in the right way, and different areas in your life can make you happy, and the money can help in many areas, but it gets to a point where a certain area is just is capped out.
Yeah.
The rate of diminishing return just kicks in. It's like, imagine if you're using public transport, you'd rather have a car, so you get the money to buy a car. That's great. You'll be even happier if you have the money to have a new one, even happier if you have the money to make sure any problem that occur with tires, brake pads, whatever it is, you can easily afford the expense. You're not having to worry that a £2,000 expense might come up. It's not an issue. That'll make you happy. It make you a bit more happier if, let's say, you can have one for your partner as well. So if both of you need to drive, you can both drive. Maybe if you've got a child that's, of driving age and they've passed their license, they can buy one for them. But probably beyond that, having more cars and really expensive cars isn't gonna make you as happy as when you first was able to get the car, when you was, making sure that you can cover the expenses of the car, the insurance and all that stuff, get your wife the car as well. At that point, you're probably done with cars. But then you can focus it on, let's say, obviously, in America, you have, health insurance, making sure you got, good health insurance. But then again, same with food, making sure that you can, afford the grocery shop that you want to do. But it gets to a point where spending $20,000 on the grocery shop, a week isn't going to make you happier than probably just spending, I don't know, again, I don't know how much of a grocery shop costs in America, but let's say 500 to 1,000, which
Yeah.
I will assume that'll get you a nice set of groceries at decent
That'll
quality.
get you a lot.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think the happiness between 1,000 and 20,000 is going to be 20 times. It might be an extra 10%.
Yeah.
And it's just, same with going out. You'll get to a point where spending 100 grand on a meal probably ain't going to make you much happier than being able to spend a couple of 100 each on a meal, for example. And then the same with your house, and same with, going on holidays and whatnot. But then realizing there's so much that you can do that is just cheap or free. It's like, playing games. If you're buying a console, the console's same for everyone. Like, an Xbox Series X is the best Xbox you can get. PlayStation 5 disc version is the best PlayStation you can get. And those consoles cost less than £500. Each. It doesn't get better than that in terms of if you want a console game experience. Yes, you can get a nicer TV, but then even that gets to a certain point. Yeah, you can have some nice speakers, but that gets to a certain point, and then beyond that, the experience for gaming is the same.
Yep. And at a certain point, you don't need to be investing more in things. You need to be investing more in yourself. And I think that's the big difference there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, totally agree. Investing in yourself, growing, investing in the people around you, in experiences. Again, that's not to say that things don't help, things aren't important, because they're good as
They
well.
are, absolutely.
Yeah, but not putting so much of a focus on the things and the pursuit of immense wealth, where you could have, let's say you got to the 10 million mark, a lot of money, you get to that mark at the age of 35, but you don't enjoy life, and instead you try and enjoy life at the age of 65 when you have 100 million. The reality is you probably would have been far better at just, if not fully stopping, slow it down a bit. So, invest a bit. So it's still going up, but, enjoying your life more, spending time with family, learning, reading books. Maybe you love TV shows and movies, and maybe you've always wanted to direct, get a few friends together. You've got the money, buy some nice camera equipment and do some, just indie directing, something like that. That'll probably make you far happier than getting to that 100 million, or from the 100 million to the billion mark.
Yep, absolutely.
So that's all the questions I've got, Zoe. I want to say thank you for taking the time to come onto the podcast today. It's been really insightful. First ever narrative designer that I've had on. I've had artists, I've had programmers, I've had managers, all sorts of people, but narrative designer, this is definitely a first. I also want to thank, Xbox as well, because for the audience, I was in communication with the people over at Xbox to get Zoe on the podcast. I want to thank them for getting all that hooked up and sorted as well. So thank you, Zoe, for coming on. Do you have any closing remarks before we wrap up?
Oh gosh, just thank you so much for having me. And yeah, to all of you out there who are interested in either narrative design or game design, I am available. Feel free to shoot me a message. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find and contact me via my website, meanderingmedievalist.com, or through the podcast at Maniculum, whatever you want to do. I'd be happy to chat with you about that. And yeah, keep putting yourself out there. Be courageous and it'll come.
Sounds good. What I'll do, everyone, is I'll get all those links off Zoe, LinkedIn, Twitter, website, everything like that, and anything else she wants to share for you guys. So I'll put that in the description, so you can just click on it and go directly to it like that. So again, thank you, Zoe, for coming on. It was a great talk, and I'll love to have you on the podcast again sometime. Take care.
Thank you.